Tonight, we're going somewhere cold, somewhere ancient. A place where the wind howls through tiny windows and the snow piles high outside crooked wooden doors. No electricity, no heaters, just wool, fire, and centuries of wisdom. You see, people once lived through winters that would chill your bones, and they did it with nothing but their hands, their animals, and each other. In this story, we'll curl up inside a smoky cottage from the year 1300 and discover how medieval peasants survived the coldest nights of the year. From walls made of clay and manure, to shared beds, to meals that simmered for weeks, every sound, every shadow tells a story. So lay back, close your eyes, and let the crackle of the hearth guide you. This is the warmth of the past. Welcome to the Middle Ages. If you enjoy this kind of quiet storytelling, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if your heart says yes. Leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I always love knowing who's out there drifting into the story with me. And let's begin our journey. Have you ever stopped to wonder how medieval peasants, people without electricity, modern insulation, or central heating, managed to survive through the harsh, unforgiving winters of the Middle Ages? Picture a frozen landscape. The wind howling through the trees, snow piled high against the edges of thatched roofs. And yet, inside those humble homes, peasant families sat by the fire, warm enough to sleep, eat, and live their daily lives. How did they do it? The answer lies not in brute endurance, but in ingenious design, centuries of experimentation, and a deep understanding of the natural world. Let's begin with the homes themselves. Contrary to what many of us imagine, rickety wooden shacks slapped together with a few planks, medieval peasant houses were surprisingly sophisticated. One of their most clever adaptations was a technique that would make any modern eco-architect proud: partial earth sheltering. These homes were typically dug about 2 to 3 feet into the ground. That may not sound like much, but this shallow trench created a world of difference when it came to warmth. By lowering the home slightly beneath the surface, peasants made use of the earth's natural insulation. Soil retains heat better than air, so the deeper the structure, the more stable the temperature inside. During the icy months, these semi-sunken homes could be up to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, about 5.5 degrees warmer than homes built fully above ground. It was, quite literally, a medieval form of geothermal heating, and they didn't even know the term for it. But digging into the ground wasn't the only smart feature. Medieval peasants took a minimalist approach to windows, which were tiny, often no bigger than a human head. Why? Because windows, especially glassless ones, let in drafts and let out precious heat. So instead of the large sun-drenched windows we love today, their homes had narrow openings, often shuttered with wood or animal skins, that kept the chill at bay. Ceiling height was another strategic choice. Unlike the grand, high-vaulted ceilings of castles and cathedrals, peasant homes kept it low, literally. Low ceilings meant that warm air, produced by the central hearth, wouldn't rise too far out of reach. Instead, it stayed closer to the people who needed it most. And then there were the walls. At first glance, you might think these were made from simple mud or straw. But the reality is far more fascinating and a bit messier. The typical medieval peasant home was constructed using a technique known as wattle and daub. Wattle refers to a lattice of woven sticks like a giant basket stretched across the frame of the home. Daub was a thick, sticky plaster made from clay, straw, and, brace yourself, manure. Yes, that's right, animal dung. Why dung, you ask? Because it worked. The mixture, once dried, became a surprisingly effective insulator. It hardened into a semi-breathable material that trapped heat in the winter and kept things cool in the summer. Archaeological studies have shown that this material provided insulation on par with basic modern fiberglass. And, believe it or not, the organic material helped regulate humidity, reducing mold and condensation inside the house. Of course, there was the smell to contend with. But when your options were cozy with a bit of barnyard aroma or frozen stiff by morning, the choice was clear. Beyond just the materials, the layout of these homes was brilliantly adapted to cold weather. Typically, they consisted of a single room where cooking, eating, sleeping, and socializing all took place. This compact design wasn't just due to lack of space or money. It was efficient. One warm room is easier to heat than 3 cold ones. In fact, this open concept layout helped trap and circulate warmth throughout the space without letting it dissipate into separate, drafty chambers. Peasants even went so far as to consider the orientation of their homes. They aligned doors and walls to maximize sun exposure, allowing light and heat to filter in during the coldest parts of the day. In some regions, homes faced east to catch the morning sun, warming the interior naturally before the fire was even lit. What's more, the roofs of these homes were marvels in their own right. Thatched with layers of straw or reeds, these thick coverings not only kept out the rain, but acted as another insulative barrier. Roofs were often built at a steep angle, not just for snow to slide off easily, but to prevent heavy drifts from collapsing the structure. The air trapped in the layers of thatch added to the home's insulating qualities, making it feel like living inside a giant straw blanket. Interestingly, many of these homes were intentionally designed to be a little smoky inside. That might sound unpleasant, but it had a purpose. Smoke from the hearth would rise and collect near the ceiling, where it created a thin layer of warm air. It also served as a natural insect repellent, protecting the thatch from mites and rot. Modern research has even suggested that the smoky environment helped preserve the roofing materials, sometimes doubling their lifespan. Seasonal adjustments were part of the yearly rhythm of peasant life. As the cold months approached, families would reinforce their walls with fresh daub, add extra layers of thatch, and sometimes hang blankets, furs, or old tapestries along the walls to provide further insulation. These makeshift wall hangings weren't just decorative. They were functional, acting like medieval versions of thermal curtains. In the end, what makes medieval peasant homes so remarkable isn't just the materials they used or the clever layouts they designed. It's that all of it, every stick, every choice of direction, every layer of poop plaster, was a product of collective wisdom. Generation after generation learned what worked, passed it down, improved it slightly, and moved on. Over the course of centuries, these homes evolved into fine-tuned machines of warmth and survival, far more advanced than we often give them credit for. They didn't have thermostats or central heating, but they had knowledge, experience, and an unshakable will to make life livable, even cozy, in the coldest of times. So the next time you're wrapped in a heated blanket or sipping cocoa by the fire, remember this. Somewhere, long ago, a medieval peasant was surviving winter in a house half buried in the earth, its smoky, thatched roof holding the heat in, while walls made of sticks and dung stood strong against the bitter wind. And they were warm. If the walls of a medieval peasant's house were its bones, then the hearth at the center was its beating heart, steady, glowing, and vital. It was far more than just a fireplace. It was the stove, the heater, the nightlight, and the very soul of the home. Step into a medieval cottage on a winter evening. The wind hisses outside, slipping between cracks in the thatch. But inside there's a golden light dancing across rough wooden beams. At the center of the room, there's a low, stone-lined pit. This is the central hearth, and it's been burning since before dawn. Above it, a blackened pot simmers slowly, its lid rattling as steam escapes in little bursts. The fire crackles softly, and its heat fills the one-room house like a warm embrace. This hearth was no ordinary fire pit. It was, in many ways, the medieval equivalent of a modern microwave, radiator, and Facebook feed all rolled into one. Yes, really. Let's start with the obvious. It kept everyone warm. In homes with no separate rooms and no insulation beyond straw and daub, the hearth was the only real source of heat. But here's the remarkable part. Archaeological studies of homes from around 1300 show that a well-built hearth could maintain indoor temperatures between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, even when the world outside had turned to ice. For us modern folks, that might seem chilly, but to a peasant used to frostbite and frozen wells, it was practically a tropical getaway. The hearth didn't just warm bodies, it warmed spirits too. This was where people gathered, not just to eat or work, but to talk. The fire brought people close, both physically and emotionally. Stories were told here, songs sung, gossip whispered. If someone's cow had wandered off, or a neighbor's ox had been seen with someone else's cart, this was where the tale would be spun, as sparks floated up into the rafters. In the warm, flickering glow, community was forged night after night. But the magic of the hearth went deeper still. It was carefully placed in the exact center of the room, not against a wall like in modern homes, but right in the heart of everything. This wasn't laziness or poor design, it was strategic genius. The central position meant the heat radiated evenly across the space. It allowed every corner of the small room to benefit from the fire's warmth, especially the bedding areas tucked far from the door and windows. In homes where the difference between comfort and freezing might come down to a few degrees, this mattered enormously. The hearth also cooked every meal. Peasants didn't have ovens, grills, or stovetops. They had the fire, and they knew how to use it. Porridges, stews, breads, and roasted vegetables all came from this same glowing source. Meals simmered slowly over the flames for hours, even days, layering flavor while warming the air. And here's where it gets even more fascinating. The hearth was also part of a clever air system. Remember how medieval peasants let their homes get a little smoky on purpose? That wasn't poor ventilation. That was innovation. The smoke that rose from the hearth didn't just disappear uselessly into the rafters. It settled just below the ceiling, creating a thermal barrier, a layer of warm air that helped trap heat inside the house. It also acted as a kind of natural bug spray, deterring insects and keeping the thatch above from rotting too quickly. In fact, tests on preserved medieval roofing materials show that this constant exposure to smoke could double the lifespan of a thatched roof. So, yes, you might cough now and then, and your eyes might water if you sat too close, but at least you didn't have to patch your roof every year. A fair trade, many would argue. Children grew up understanding the rhythms of the hearth. They knew how to stir the pot, when to add wood, how to keep embers glowing through the night. Tending the fire was a sacred task passed from parent to child, a responsibility as serious as tending to livestock or repairing the fence. A dying fire meant a cold night, and worse, spoiled food or sickness. The hearth also shaped how the rest of the home was organized. Sleeping areas were placed as far from the door as possible to avoid drafts, and as close to the hearth as safety allowed. Wooden stools, cooking pots, baskets, and even shoes were arranged with heat in mind, not decoration. This wasn't a space designed to impress. It was designed to survive. And survive it did. Peasant families didn't just endure the winters, they learned to master them. And the hearth was their anchor through every frost-bitten night. You see, warmth in the Middle Ages wasn't just a luxury, it was life itself. It meant fewer illnesses, fewer frost-bitten fingers, and fewer sleepless nights. It meant your bread could rise, your baby could sleep, and your water jug wouldn't freeze into a solid block by morning. It meant that, even in the darkest depths of winter, there was still a place, small though it may have been, where laughter could rise with the smoke, and people could gather close, wrapped in blankets, the orange firelight dancing on their cheeks. In that one glowing hearth, there was comfort, connection, and above all else, hope. If the hearth was the glowing heart of a medieval home, then the walls, roof, and placement of that home were its quiet wisdom, carefully shaped by centuries of watching the sun, feeling the wind, and learning to listen to nature's rhythms. You see, medieval peasants didn't just throw up houses wherever there was space. Each home was placed with intention. The direction the house faced mattered, and so did the angle of the roof, the height of the doorway, and even the size of the windows. It was a kind of folk science, one not written in books, but passed down from grandmother to grandson, from father to daughter, carved into every beam and bundle of straw. Most medieval peasant homes were oriented toward the path of the sun. That meant that during the cold winter months, when every precious drop of warmth mattered, their front doors and main walls would catch the most sunlight possible. Even with tiny, shuttered windows, a bit of morning or midday light could help warm the interior just enough to take the edge off the biting cold. And yes, those windows were tiny, barely larger than your head. They weren't there to let in scenic views or fresh air. No, they were meant to keep the heat in and the cold out. Every inch of opening in a wall was a potential leak in the warmth that the hearth worked so hard to build. Peasants knew this instinctively. Instead of glass, which was far too expensive, they might cover their window holes with thin animal hide, oiled cloth, or wooden shutters, whatever worked to block out the chill. Then there were the roofs, perhaps the most overlooked yet brilliant part of the entire design. To survive snowy winters, these roofs were built with steep pitches, angled sharply to shed snow quickly, so it wouldn't build up and collapse the structure. But they couldn't be too steep, or else the layers of thatch, the long, dry straw used to keep out the wind and rain, might slide right off in a heavy gust. It was a delicate balance, steep enough to withstand the storm, but gentle enough to hold the weight of their only real defense against the sky. That thatch was its own kind of magic. Made from straw, reeds, or even heather, it wasn't just a rustic decoration. It was a living layer of insulation. Air became trapped between the bundles, forming a protective barrier against both the heat of summer and the cold of winter. Properly laid thatch was water-resistant, breathable, and warm. But it wasn't everlasting. Every few years, peasants would patch it with new bundles, carefully layering fresh straw onto old, a humble but effective form of roofing maintenance. And when winter came knocking each year, the home itself changed with the season. Come autumn, there would be a flurry of activity. Cracks in the walls would be sealed with fresh daub, that familiar mixture of clay, straw, and manure. It wasn't glamorous, but it was effective, blocking drafts, keeping pests out, and tightening the home's shell against the wind. Extra thatch might be added to the roof, a winter blanket, thick and golden. Blankets or animal skins would be hung on the walls like tapestries, not for beauty, but for warmth. These humble coverings, often made from rough spun wool or hide, acted as insulation against the biting air. A particularly cold home might see layers of old clothing, sackcloth, or even moss pressed between the wall slats. Inside, families would begin rearranging their furniture, if they had any, to make better use of the warmth. Sleeping areas were moved farther from doors and closer to the hearth. Beds were stuffed with fresh straw, layered with blankets, cloaks, or fur, anything that would trap body heat overnight. In some homes, families even insulated their floors with rushes, reeds, or dry leaves, scattered thickly and renewed often. This not only kept the cold from creeping up through the ground, but also absorbed moisture, making the air inside the home just a bit more tolerable. And perhaps most remarkably, homes were intentionally smoky. Yes, smoky. It was another clever tactic in a long line of improvisation. The smoke from the hearth, instead of escaping through a chimney, which many peasant homes didn't have, would rise and collect under the roof beams. There it served two quiet but powerful purposes. First, it acted as an insulating layer, keeping the warm air from escaping too quickly through the thatch. And second, it helped preserve the roof itself. Insects, mold, and moisture didn't stand a chance against the constant smoke. It was uncomfortable, yes, But in the trade-off between smoke and frostbite, most peasants chose smoke. Even sunlight was a carefully used tool. During the short winter days, families would open shutters just enough to let in a shaft of warmth, then quickly shut them as dusk fell. Some homes were even built with angled entrances, doorways turned just slightly from the wind, so the fiercest gales wouldn't barrel straight into the center of the room. Every detail mattered. Nothing was random, and nothing was wasted. To us, it might look like a small, smoky, dirt-floored cottage, but to the people who lived there, it was a marvel of design, an ever-changing structure that bent with the seasons, breathed with the air, and offered safety through the long, dark nights. This was architecture, not built with blueprints and budgets, but with memory, instinct, and patience. Each winter brought new lessons. Each generation added new tricks. And slowly, over the course of centuries, these simple peasant homes became quiet miracles of survival. Warm, wise, and built not just to endure the cold, but to quietly, bravely thrive within it. When the last embers of daylight faded and the village slipped into quiet shadow, medieval peasants didn't simply drift off to sleep and hope for warmth. No, they had a plan, a routine passed down through generations, built not on comfort, but on survival. You see, in a world without clocks or central heating, timing wasn't just helpful, it was everything. And so the rhythm of life in medieval winter was set to the sun, the fire, and the frost. During the coldest months, each village had what was called a frost watch, a quiet but essential tradition. Each night, while others slept, someone would stay awake to tend the fire, keep an eye on the weather, and ensure no one froze in their sleep. It might be the eldest son one night, a grandmother the next, or a neighbor across the lane. They sat close to the hearth, listening to the wind push against the wooden walls, watching how fast water in clay pots began to freeze. If the frost came in faster than expected, they would send out a signal, sometimes a knock on the door, a shouted word, or the ringing of a handbell. That meant it was time. Everyone had to hunker down, seal the doors, and use every trick they knew to keep the warmth in. These watchers weren't just helpful, they were crucial. A forgotten fire could mean disaster. One recorded case from 1291 tells of a man who fell asleep during his watch and had to give up half his winter firewood as punishment. That may sound harsh, but in a village where every stick counted, the cost of failure was high. And then there was the sleep itself, split in two like the night sky. Modern folks think of sleep as a single solid block, 8 hours straight if we're lucky. But medieval peasants had a different pattern, one that might surprise you. They slept in 2 shifts known today as first sleep and second sleep. It went like this. As darkness fell, families would gather around the hearth, eat their evening meal, say prayers or tell stories, and then lie down together, huddled for warmth. This was first sleep, often beginning not long after sunset. It might last 3 or 4 hours. Then, sometime around midnight, people would wake up, not in a panic, not because they couldn't sleep, but because that was simply part of the rhythm of life. In this quiet hour between sleeps, the village came subtly alive again. Some people would stoke the fire, others would check on livestock, or even step outside to gauge the weather. Couples might share a quiet conversation, a prayer, or a more intimate moment. Some villages even used this time to read, mend clothes, or write letters by firelight or candle glow. This peaceful interlude might last an hour or two, after which the second sleep would begin, a return to rest that carried them gently into the dawn. Interestingly, medieval doctors actually encouraged this split sleep pattern, believing it healthier for the body and mind. And today, modern sleep researchers are starting to rediscover that our natural circadian rhythms may indeed favor this pattern. A sleep divided not by stress, but by intention. Imagine that. the coldest nights of the year, and yet these people found time not only to sleep but to wake mindfully, to share warmth, words, and quiet labor. Even more fascinating was how tightly scheduled the entire community was during these months. The golden hours, between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., when the sun stood highest, were sacred. That's when most outdoor work was done, when chores were performed, and when you'd better be seen contributing. Medieval manor court records from the year 1267 show that villagers could be fined if they didn't work during these key daylight hours. One village in northern England even had a system where repeat offenders had to donate extra firewood to the community stockpile. And yet, despite the harshness of their world, there was also remarkable fairness and balance. Each family took turns with frost watch duties. If you were too old or too young, others would step in. If your house was especially drafty, neighbors might help patch your thatch before the real cold set in. Warmth wasn't just an individual goal, it was a shared responsibility. In fact, some villages even developed point systems for behavior during winter. If you were caught working too long outdoors after a cold warning, you lost points. Too many lost points, and you might have to take extra watch duty, or worse, be assigned the coldest corner of the communal hall during gatherings. There's a certain beauty to all of it, not in comfort, perhaps, but in care, in the idea that every spark mattered, every moment of sleep was intentional, and every villager had a role to play in keeping the community safe from winter's reach. And while today we chase thermostats and complain about drafts in heated homes, medieval peasants lit a fire, shared the bed, and watched the frost with quiet reverence. They didn't conquer the cold, they danced with it. Step by step, breath by breath, sleep by sleep.
When the frost crept in and the fields fell silent under snow, the medieval peasant turned from the plow to the pantry. Because in a world where food didn't come from markets, but from the soil and sweat of your own back, survival wasn't just about warmth, it was about preparation. And prepare they did, not with fridges or freezers, but with time-tested wisdom, quiet observation, and a little bit of magic. Long before the first snowflake touched the ground, the preservation rituals had begun. In late summer and early autumn, the village came alive with motion. Vegetables were harvested, roots pulled, fruits gathered, not just to be eaten, but to be saved, stored, hidden away like treasure. Because winter would be long, and every carrot, turnip, and onion would have to last. But this was not guesswork. Medieval peasants weren't just stuffing food into cellars and hoping for the best. They had a system, a science even. Take vegetables, for example. They didn't just throw them all into a hole in the ground. They knew which crops could stand the cold and which needed more care. A manuscript from 1283 lists vegetables by their cold resistance. Turnips and onions were winter warriors, while delicate greens were consumed quickly or dried for soups. It was a kind of medieval spreadsheet, etched in ink and memory. Roots and tubers were kept in underground storage pits, cool and dark, lined with straw and sometimes even snow. These earth refrigerators could preserve food until May, long after the world had thawed. Archaeologists have found these pits in England, still showing traces of ancient straw, packed in neat, careful layers. And it wasn't just about digging holes, oh no. They understood the deeper science even if they didn't call it that. The walls of these storage chambers were often thick and lined with clay, designed to maintain a constant temperature and humidity level. Some pits were divided into zones, and families would rotate their food between them, based on changing conditions, a medieval version of a climate-controlled pantry. Fruits like apples and pears were wrapped in cloth and stored in barrels with dried leaves or hay, each layer protected like an egg in a nest. Dried herbs were tied in bundles and hung from ceiling beams, their fragrance lingering even in the coldest weeks of February. For meat, salt was the hero. Without refrigeration, the only way to keep meat from spoiling was to remove the water, and that meant drying or curing. Meat was salted heavily, then hung in the rafters near the hearth, where the low, steady heat and swirling smoke helped dry it slowly. Sometimes it was smoked over smoldering wood for days, even weeks, infusing it with flavor and extending its life. Fish, too, was dried or pickled, especially in coastal areas. Inland villages might trade for preserved fish from distant markets, herring mostly, salted and packed in barrels, a valuable and nutritious staple during Lent and lean months. But perhaps the most ingenious technique of all was fermentation. Long before we knew the word probiotic, peasants were fermenting cabbage into sauerkraut, grains into sour beer, and milk into cheese. These foods didn't just last, they grew healthier with time. Recent studies show medieval fermented foods had up to 10 times more probiotic bacteria than many of our modern versions. It was gut science, born not in labs, but in smoky kitchens and cold barns. And then there were the one-pot meals, stews and porridges that never truly ended. In some homes, the cooking pot stayed on the hearth for weeks. Its contents refreshed each day with new ingredients, a handful of lentils, a leftover bone, a slice of bread. It simmered constantly, and in doing so killed harmful bacteria and stretched calories further. Archaeological traces from medieval cooking pots confirm it. Layered flavors, long cooking times, and the careful balancing of fat, starch, and broth. There's even a porridge recipe from 1278 that advises cooking the grains until soft as a child's tooth. Slightly gross, perhaps, but brilliantly efficient. Longer cooking broke down complex starches, making the food easier to digest and more calorie-dense. Exactly what the body needed to stay warm and strong. All of this wasn't just about cleverness. It was about survival through rhythm, learning what worked, repeating what worked, and passing it on. Villages would often appoint food stewards or storage watchers responsible for checking the condition of stored produce. If roots showed frostbite, the pit needed more thatch. If onions began to sprout, they needed more airflow. It was a constant dialogue between human and food, with no room for laziness. And then there was the cold itself. In places where snow piled high, peasants would dig snow pits, actual outdoor refrigerators where food was packed in snow, covered in straw, and kept fresh for months. Modern archaeologists have measured some of these pits and found they could maintain internal temperatures of 35 to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 to 3 degrees Celsius, for weeks, even after the surface snow had melted. That's better than many modern camping coolers. But food preservation didn't stop at storage. It extended to community sharing. During harsh winters, neighbors would pool their preserved goods. If one family lost their onions to rot, another might offer a bag of dried beans in exchange for cured pork. Barter, kindness, and careful planning. These were the foundations of the winter table. And somehow, from all this hard work, the peasants created feasts. Not the lavish banquets of kings, but warm bowls of thick stew, slices of smoked meat, crusty bread with fermented butter, and perhaps a mug of cider or mead. Meals that comforted, warmed, and filled. Meals that carried with them the memory of the harvest, the promise of spring, and the quiet triumph of having prepared well. Before the sun had even risen, and long after the stars had faded into dawn, the medieval peasant was already preparing for the cold. Not with buttons, zippers, or weather apps, but with wool, instinct, and animal fat. Because long before layering became a fashion trend, peasants had turned it into a science, an art even, and wool was their paintbrush, their shield, their second skin. Wool was everything. Soft when needed, rough when necessary, warm even when wet. Abundant in sheep-rich regions, and woven with care by hands that knew the cold like an old friend. Medieval peasants didn't own many clothes, but what they had was built for endurance. Imagine waking up in a tiny smoky cottage. Frost clings to the edge of the door frame. The breath of the cows lingers in the rafters like mist. Your first instinct? Reach for layer 1, a thin, soft tunic of wool, worn close to the skin, not for looks, for insulation. This was the base, a layer designed to trap warmth close to the body. Then came layer 2, and sometimes 3, 4, even 5, each thicker, coarser, and heavier than the last. Some outer garments were woven with lanolin-rich wool,
still carrying the natural oils of the sheep, giving them remarkable water resistance. Archaeologists studying preserved medieval garments found that unwashed wool retained up to 40% more resistance to moisture than washed versions. And when that wasn't enough, they added fat. Yes, animal fat, usually sheep tallow or deer grease, carefully rubbed into the fabric, creating a natural barrier against rain, sleet, and snow. Add to that a bit of tree sap from pine or birch, and suddenly a peasant's cloak could hold off a storm for hours. In modern lab tests, these recreated garments stood up to 4 hours of heavy rain without soaking through. Not bad for something made with nothing more than hands, wool, and a bit of countryside wisdom. But it wasn't just the fabric, it was the engineering. Take their hoods, for example. At first glance, they look silly, floppy, oversized, maybe even impractical. But dig a little deeper, and you'll see clever design. These hoods were made from multiple panels, stitched together in a way that allowed them to be adjusted with the wind. Facing the wind head-on, pull the front panel forward. Turning to the side, tuck it back. When tested in wind tunnels, these hoods reduced wind chill exposure by up to 60%. Not bad for something made with bone needles and elbow grease. And those pointy, almost comical-looking shoes. They weren't a fashion statement. They were thermal strategy. Designed with narrow tips and elevated soles, they minimized contact with frozen ground, reducing the surface area where body heat could escape. Some were even stuffed with straw or moss, changed daily to stay dry and warm, a peasant's version of thermal socks.
Clothing, for the medieval peasant, wasn't just personal, it was communal.
Families often slept fully clothed, tucked under wool blankets, with children in the middle and elders on the sides. Wool tunics doubled as pajamas. Heavy cloaks became bedding. Scarves were passed from hand to hand, warmed by one body before being worn by another. And the making of these clothes? A village affair. Spinning wool wasn't just women's work. It was everyone's work. Come autumn, villages would hold spinning bees, community gatherings where people sat together, spun yarn, shared stories, and preserved warmth with every twist of the spindle. It wasn't just practical, it was comforting. A kind of social glue wrapped in wool threads. And as bodies worked, so did body heat. Studies of reconstructed medieval homes show that during these gatherings, the combined warmth of 20 to 30 people in one room could raise temperatures by up to 8 degrees Celsius, 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Warmth that lasted for hours, even after everyone had gone home. That was the magic of wool. It didn't just insulate your skin, it held memories, effort, and warmth from those around you. Some cloaks were handed down for generations. Others were buried with their owners, mended and patched so many times they had become maps of a life lived through winters. A stitch here from a mother, a patch there from a sister, a bit of blue wool from a festival long ago. These garments weren't clothing, they were stories. They whispered, "I kept you warm when the frost bit hardest. I was there when your child was born, when the fire died low, when the snow came early and the roof leaked. I wrapped around you when the wind howled and hope was thin." And though the outside world was cruel and cold, within those many layers of wool, held together by sweat, soil, and simple skill, the medieval peasant found a shield against the winter. Not perfect, not fashionable, but enough. Enough to carry them through the dark months, until the first shoots of green broke through the frost, and the fields called them back once more. In the heart of every medieval village stood something greater than any one house, any one family. It wasn't the tallest building, or the most beautiful, but it was often the warmest. The communal hall. When the snow came early, when firewood ran low, when frost slipped under every door frame, this was where villagers turned, not out of weakness, but out of wisdom.
because even in the harshest winters, they knew. Together, they stood a better chance. These halls weren't grand like cathedrals or fortified like castles. They were modest. Long wooden structures with thick thatched roofs, earthen floors, and wide hearths that never went cold, but to those who gathered inside, they were lifelines. Built low and wide, the communal hall was engineered with care. Some had double-door entryways that acted like airlocks, minimizing drafts each time someone stepped in. Others were aligned with the wind, not to catch it, but to deflect it. A shield against the north, a hand cupped gently around a flame. Inside, it was often warmer than any home, not because of better insulation, but because of people. 20, 30, sometimes even 50 villagers might share the space during the worst cold snaps. Body heat, generated naturally, would rise and collect under the low ceiling, creating a microclimate that could be 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, 20 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than the outside world. Add in a few animals, a cow or two near the door, perhaps some pigs toward the rear, and suddenly the room pulsed with warmth, breath, and life. They didn't just sit idly. There were heat-sharing rotations, times when families would take turns hosting or joining these group gatherings. Manor records from the 1200s describe rotating heat sessions, like winter block parties with a single goal: keep everyone warm, together. There were even frost wardens, community-appointed individuals who began planning for winter survival months in advance. Their job wasn't just gathering wood. It was organizing, coordinating, making sure no one was left behind. Who had the best hearth? Who had space for 2 more bodies? Who had extra blankets to share? These weren't just questions, they were lifelines, woven into the rhythm of the village year. And the sharing didn't stop at houses. Churches, too, were sanctuaries in more ways than one. Many had a special chamber called a calefactory, a warming room usually reserved for the sick or elderly during the coldest nights. Simple but powerful, a fire, a bench, and the knowledge that warmth was a mercy offered freely. Some churches even had heated passageways connecting them to nearby homes or kitchens. Archaeologists once thought these were for transporting food, until soot marks and ash residue revealed their true purpose: heat corridors, guiding warmth from one building to another like veins carrying blood through a body. And then there were the hot stones. After baking bread in large communal ovens, villagers would take the leftover heat in the form of flat rocks, wrap them in cloth, and deliver them to the elderly or ill. A hot stone under the blanket could keep someone warm through the night, long after the fire had died down. It was medieval kindness made tangible, a gift of warmth passed from hand to hand. In some villages, the organization was so precise that heat was measured, tracked, and shared almost like currency. One record from 1278 details how a family who couldn't contribute firewood was allowed to stay in the communal hall, but only if they helped with cooking and cleaning. Another tells of a man fined half a goat for hoarding wool blankets during a storm while his neighbors shivered. But for every selfish act, there were 10 stories of compassion. Like the village where the poorest families were given the warmest corners of the hall near the hearth, or the elderly woman who couldn't walk to the communal fire, so the village children took turns carrying her meals and reheating her stones each day, or the group of widows who pooled their meager firewood to keep a newborn child warm through a bitter February night. Because in the medieval world, warmth was never just about temperature. It was about presence. It was about proximity. It was about being near others, not just for heat, but for hope. And so the communal hall became more than a building. It became a place of laughter in hard times, a place where songs were sung, stories were shared, and silence was held together when words weren't enough. A place where winter wasn't just endured, but met with unity. Even today, when archaeologists uncover the stone foundations of these halls, they often find evidence of life in every corner. Fragments of bowls, drops of wax from candles, animal bones,
from shared meals, traces of gatherings that lasted deep into the night. And though the fires have long since gone out, the warmth remains, not in the stone, not in the ash, but in the memory of how, in the coldest nights of the year, these simple people built something beautiful, a circle of care, a house of shared heat, a home made not of wood and straw, but of each other.
In the chill of a medieval winter night, when winds howled like wolves through thatched roofs and frost painted the windows in ghostly lace, the warmest place in the house wasn't by the fire, it was beneath the floor. Not everyone had this luxury, of course. But for many medieval peasants, especially in Northern Europe, the home was more than a shelter for people, it was also a stable for animals. Cows, pigs, chickens, even goats and geese shared the space, separated only by a half wall or raised platform. To the modern eye, it might seem unsanitary, perhaps even unthinkable, but to the people of the time, it was clever, necessary, life-saving. Because animals, like people, give off heat. And in a world where firewood was precious and blankets were few, every degree mattered. Medieval builders understood this, even if they didn't have thermometers to prove it. They often constructed homes with split levels or partially sunken animal stalls, so that body heat from livestock would rise into the living area. Some designs even encouraged convection currents, warm air rising from the animals below, circulating into the sleeping loft above. It wasn't an accident. It was design. Primitive, perhaps, but remarkably effective. Cows, in particular, were prized winter companions, not just for milk or meat, but for their warmth. A single adult cow can generate up to 1,200 watts of heat, roughly equivalent to a small electric heater. Put 2 or 3 in a sheltered space beneath a raised wooden floor, and you've got a living radiator, working night and day without complaint. Even pigs, smaller and smellier though they were, had their place. They produced about half as much heat as a cow, but were often kept closer to the sleeping areas, their stalls insulated with straw, their heat redirected upward. Archaeological evidence from preserved medieval farmhouses shows specialized floor plans, animals placed strategically, not randomly. Warmer animals nearer the people, cooler ones or storage animals further out. Some homes even featured vent holes or slats in the floor, allowing warmth to rise without letting the animals climb up. It was medieval zoning, based not on property lines, but on heat output. And this relationship was reciprocal. Animals benefited too. Being near humans meant protection from wind and wolves, and even warmth in return. Shared breath, shared body heat, shared survival. Villages sometimes appointed animal heat assessors, individuals who evaluated each family's livestock based on age, size, and health. A young, healthy ox, prime heat. An aging goat, less so. These assessments help determine where families might be placed during community heat-sharing efforts, or whether someone's home was warm enough to shelter others. Some of the most remarkable finds in medieval ruins are the feeding systems designed to minimize heat loss. Instead of opening the door each time hay or water was needed, peasants used chutes, hatches, or wall-cut openings, allowing food to be dropped in from inside the house. It kept the warmth in and made care easier on icy mornings. And beneath all this, quite literally, was another unexpected ally: composting bedding. Medieval animal stalls were often layered with straw, manure, and more straw, again and again throughout the season. This thick bedding, left undisturbed, began to compost, breaking down and generating low, steady heat. It wasn't much, but in the coldest months, it could raise the temperature by several degrees. Combined with the animal's own warmth, it became a natural, self-sustaining heating system. Modern researchers studying reconstructed medieval barns have confirmed it. The deep litter method worked. It insulated the floor, warmed the air, and even helped prevent respiratory illnesses by maintaining stable humidity, avoiding the dry air that often causes coughing in cold climates. But it wasn't all warm and cozy.
With the animals came smells, noise, the occasional kick in the night, and yes, the ever-present risk of fire. One stray ember near a hay pile could turn a home into an inferno. Thatched roofs and open flames were a dangerous pair. Yet peasants accepted the risk, just as they accepted the mud, the cold, and the uncertainty of each season. Because survival wasn't about perfection, it was about balance. A balance between discomfort and ingenuity, between warmth and work, between human and animal. In the shared breath of a sleeping cow, in the soft rustle of straw beneath a pig's hooves, there was comfort. Not luxury, not even ease, but comfort born of connection, of knowing that in the deep of winter when the world turned hard and still, you were not alone. The walls may have been made of wattle and dung, the roof patched and smoky, but beneath your feet, a cow shifted, exhaled, and carried your warmth forward. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Enough to make it through one more night. Enough to wake up to a dawn just slightly less cold. Enough to hope for spring. There is a kind of silence that only winter knows. Not the empty silence of abandonment or sorrow, but a peaceful quiet, heavy like snowfall, soft like wool. A stillness that falls gently over the world, making even the loudest things whisper. That was the silence the medieval peasant knew. And in that silence they did something extraordinary. They endured. But more than that, they endured together. It's easy to imagine the Middle Ages as harsh and cruel, and in many ways it was. Death came early, food was scarce, winters were long, but behind the cold facts lies something warmer. A people who learned not only to survive, but to belong. To the land, to each other, to the rhythm of fire and frost. They didn't have smart thermostats or emergency heating plans. They had wood smoke, shared breath, fermented stew, and the gentle hum of livestock beneath the floor. They had songs by the hearth, whispered stories in the dark, wool stitched by hand and passed through generations. They had walls made of manure and straw, yes, but those same walls held laughter, prayers, and promises. They knew deeply that survival was not a solo act. The old watched the fires, the young gathered the wood, mothers stirred the pot that never emptied. Fathers patched the holes in roofs, children fed the chickens, neighbors checked in, lent cloaks, whispered warnings when the frost grew sharp. And when the nights turned cruel and the cold seeped into the bones, they gathered. In communal halls warmed by nothing but each other, in churches that held not just souls, but frail bodies seeking warmth. In shared beds where 5 or 6 lay close, not for comfort but for life. They measured time not by clocks, but by the arc of the sun. Not by dates, but by how long the root cellar would last, or when the geese flew south. Their world was slow, steady, and close to the earth. And so, when the fire burned low and the wind hissed at the cracks in the wall, they didn't despair. They leaned in. They trusted the old ways, the thick bedding of straw beneath the cow, the pot of barley left to simmer overnight, the wool soaked in tallow, the child sleeping between grandparents, the stone still warm from the communal oven. Because in that world, warmth wasn't just a temperature. It was a rhythm, a ritual, a memory passed from hand to hand. Even now, centuries later, when all that remains are broken floorboards and blackened hearthstones, we can still feel it. We see it in the soot on the ceiling beams of forgotten cottages. We read it in the court records that mention firewood debts and frost fines. We trace it in the faded embroidery of cloaks found buried in the peat, stitches still holding, still warm. Perhaps the cold was never the enemy. Perhaps it was the teacher, the one that reminded them to stay close, to think ahead, to care. And maybe, just maybe, that's the story we still need to hear. Because in our modern lives, full of buttons, apps, and central heating, we've lost something. Not the ability to stay warm, but the understanding of what warmth truly is. It's not comfort. It's not luxury. It's connection. A bowl of soup passed across the room. A child tucked in beside their grandparent. A neighbor knocking at the door with kindling in hand. A fire tended not for one, but for many. That was winter in the medieval world. And maybe, in some quiet corner of the heart, it still is. So tonight, as you pull the blanket closer and listen to the wind against your window, remember, once upon a time, in a small wooden cottage with walls of twig and dung, someone just like you whispered a prayer beside a dying fire. Not for riches or glory or ease, but simply for one more warm morning. And they got it, because they had each other.